Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Gavanch, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of chatting with Jelle Vedder, who's the co founder of the engineering firm Bartels and Vedder. His firm focuses on the technical design and realization of sustainable projects, including floating residential buildings, commercial buildings, parks, and climate resilient structures. Under his leadership, the firm has delivered groundbreaking floating projects, such as the floating ferry terminal in Malaysia, the floating office in Rotterdam, and the floating farm in Rotterdam. Believing deeply in the power of collaboration to achieve great goals, Jelle promotes the motto, creating by cooperating within his companies. Outside of his professional endeavors, he enjoys sailing, sports, and building. Jelle is a pioneer in the field of floating constructions, committed to innovative and sustainable solutions in hydraulic and civil engineering. Enjoy. Hello, hello. Welcome to our podcast. Today we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Jelle Vedder. He's an innovator in durable and sustainable structures. Hi, Jelle.
Hello, nice to see you.
Well, great to see you, and thank you for joining and making the time for us. Please tell us more about yourself.
So my name is Jelle Vedder. I'm the CEO of the engineering company Bartels and Vedder, and we are focusing on sustainable, durable buildings. One example is floating buildings, floating structures, which we build throughout the world. Next to that, also flood-proof buildings and everything connected to that. So bridges, quays, etc., etc.
I know you guys work on a lot of fascinating projects. For the sake of our time today, I will focus on the floating structures that you work on because we had an opportunity to collaborate on a project and we definitely had the privilege to learn a lot from you all. And I would love to get your thoughts on, what is happening today in our global landscape, I guess, of things, and why floating structures are becoming even more relevant.
Yeah, there are several purposes for floating structures. One is to be more climate resilient. So with the current floodings, you can reduce the amount of damages during a flooding when your house is floating or your structure is floating. Next to that is that you can reuse space that you couldn't use before, especially in the cities at the moment. Everything is crowded, everything is full there, except for this old city harbors. So a lot of cities also have old city harbors. They moved their commercial harbors often to the outer range of the city, and the old harbors remain empty. So in order to have a bigger density inside the city and able people to move into the center of the city, you can reuse those old harbors for floating houses, for living, for recreation, etc. And that is what we see lately more and more happening within the cities. For example, the city of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Rotterdam, is that the old city harbors are being reused for floating houses for people to live. And that is, the tendency that we see in the current market. So 2 points: flood-proof building, especially in flood vulnerable areas alongside rivers, for example, at the moment, and increasing the density or reusing the space within the city. And that is what we see in floating structures at the moment.
Great summary. As you were talking, I'm thinking about our studio in New York is based in Brooklyn Navy Yard. And like I'm thinking of all the docks they have and what an underutilized space that is, where we could have like floating structures. And why are they not there yet? So I guess like one thing that I'm thinking about, and I see, you know, like Netherlands, I think, and you are like extremely advanced in this conversation. Why don't we see them more, right? I feel like there are, to your point, a lot of areas, I see this in the United States. I don't know what the general status is like globally, but underutilized spaces or areas that have actually high risk of natural disasters like floods. And we don't see floating structures utilized that effectively. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why.
Yeah, so it's a relative new market, although you have very old structures already floating. So it is the principle isn't new. It exists for thousands of years. In the past, they built their floating houses or for example, trees or whatever that floats. Also, the old fisherman boats were being used for living on in certain areas for hundreds of years. And just recently, the last 20, maybe 30 years, you see more and more the regular floating houses evolving. So when I started this business in 2004, we were just one of the first starting to make regulars or build regular houses on water, floating houses. There weren't even regulations in the Netherlands, for example. So we had to create our own regulations for floating houses on water. So we did that with a research facility, TNO, in the Netherlands in 2006. Those regulations were adapted in the guidelines for building on water, 2011, and nowadays it is being implemented in the building code of the Netherlands, and that was, I believe, it was since 2018. So you see that there is a relative short time in which we had the regulations. That new techniques are being developed for building on water and also for regular buildings on water. Before that, it was just like the sheds or the houseboats, so these kind of things. And nowadays, you see developments in more regular houses, office buildings, floating farms, floating parks, etc., etc. So why isn't it evolving fast enough? So as you can understand, for the regular buildings, it's a relative new market. That doesn't mean that it hasn't been built yet. So in the Netherlands, we have several projects like Eiburg, Schoonschip, Lentzeplas, with 30, 50, 60 floating houses, for example, within one project. In the United States, I believe it was Canada, there you have the floating houses as well. A little bit different than in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, we can use the basement as well for living space. In the United States, regulations stated, at least in the past, that you couldn't use the foundation for living space. So it needs to be foam filled, for example. I don't know what the latest status is, if they already adapted or changed the regulations, but you see it everywhere, only smaller projects. So what's the reason for these numbers? Well, relative new. And sometimes governments or municipalities doesn't really know how to deal with the concept of floating buildings. So I believe that is one of the reasons that there aren't that many floating projects yet. But I believe it will come in the future, that it will increase. But I believe it is more like regulations and the unknown at the moment. So if we find a project, for example, or my clients find a project or project site, it's often the permit that is the most difficult part of the floating project. The technical side of things, what we do is relatively easy because we already did numerous houses, of course. So the technical side isn't the obstruction within the project. It's more like the permits, regulations, and those kind of things. And we see that abroad as well. For example, in Dubai, we went to Dubai for, I believe it was 2018 or 2019, to develop between 500 and 2,000 floating villas. We did all the engineering for that floating villa. Then we had a conversation with the municipality of Dubai and a conversation with the harbor authority in Abu Dhabi. So the harbor authority is situated in Abu Dhabi there, and they were pointing to each other who was responsible for these kind of floating houses there. So it was planned to be built in the Dubai creeks. The municipality said, well, okay, it's floating, so it is a boat. So the harbor authorities are responsible for these objects. And the harbor authority said, well, okay, these are floating houses. So these are houses, and the municipality is responsible for these objects. So that gave some troubles between the two, and also put a little bit of a halt on the project itself. And we see that everywhere, the unknown, what kind of regulations to use, for example. So what we proposed to the municipality in Dubai was to adapt our guidelines for building on water in that time. Now it's the Dutch building code, to adapt those. We did the same in Malaysia as well. So they didn't know what kind of engineering guidelines to use, and we proposed to them to use the Eurocode, the British standards, for example, together with the nautical aspects from the Dutch building code, in order to build that project there. So we can help them, but they need to accept, of course, a little bit out of the box thinking with regards to floating projects.
I think it's an incredible case example of, we often say in design innovation is typically not the problem itself, right? Of course, like budget, timeline, whatever, we have constraints, but it's not the bottleneck, really. It's the system that we try to operate and gets in the way of innovation. And everything that you're saying around, the whether or not regulations or policies or guidelines exist, that becomes a huge a definer of whether or not we're going to do something. And to your point, that like pointing fingers is like, I think, so universal in the way like, oh wait, you do this, it's not my responsibility, it's your responsibility. Nobody wants to take our responsibility. And in those moments, like, how do you find these people that like champion innovation? And another thing, I think maybe when we see this in US, the one issue in the real estate industry, let's say, is the benchmarking, right? So we price things, or we estimate the success of things, or we know it's a quick build because of, oh, it was built before here, or was done here, or X developer did it here, so that the problem with that is also, for a project to realize, it takes at least a few years. So when it's already out there, what we're benchmarking may not be even the right thing that we're benchmarking for the day or for the future. And so it's this like constant lagging happening due to both that, like the way we benchmark in real estate. Oh, this has been built before, so it's safe. Let's do this. Also like with the regulations, I think it's very common for it to lag. I think this is an incredible case example where the bottom-up push actually led for those guidelines to be incorporated. Like the fact that, and that's like, what lobbyists do in like US, you advocate for that change to happen. And it shows like how, like to be able to innovate. And what you're saying is like the technical part is actually easy, because like it comes with all this like advocacy work that you need to do, like convincing partners, like building an entire strategy around doing something that, seems like the best option for the site or for an environment. And another saying we love is like, just because it's common sense doesn't mean it's common practice. So I think this is a great example of that. And so I think like what I'm most interested in, this would be very relevant for our audience too. Like, now it's still relatively very new, right? You talked about 20, 30 years, and the regulations or guidelines, even 2018, like it's not even 10 years, like very, very fresh.
Yeah.
So obviously there's still, I'm sure, a lot of education, advocacy around it, like convincing stakeholders, like happening still, but maybe the fact that there are guidelines or policies there, it's helpful. At least you're getting more support. Let's go back to the way earlier days when you were like pushing for this without existing guidelines in place, or not a lot of reference points either, right? What are some of, I guess, like tactics you have developed to be able to like navigate that, right? I feel like anybody who's in an innovative space has to
Mm.
have their like mental health support system. So what was yours when you were like navigating that?
Yeah, in the very beginning, when we started, we were actually more in the business of developing the floating foundations for regular houses or for floating neighborhoods, for example. So the larger platforms in order to create floating building ground or a building plot. One of the biggest issues was in that time was also the financing and the insurance of these objects. So the banks require an insurance on the platform, on the floating structure, and the insurance company often say, well, okay, we don't know it. What is the durability of this platform? Because they want to mitigate their risk with regards to these floating platforms. So one example was, for example, for the fiberglass hulls that we developed. So that is for floating houses, lightweight structures, and it was actually in 2009, I believe, we developed that new technique. The first thing that we did was asking the bank, okay, what kind of financing period or a mortgage period we can put on these kind of structures with fiberglass hull, because we never did it before. It was completely new in the world. So for boats, we already know it, but it's a different kind of object. But we used the technology in a little different way in these floating houses. The bank actually said to me, so that was actually the manager of the mortgages of the ING bank in the Netherlands. It's one of the biggest banks. I believe they are in the United States as well. And they told me, or he told me, well, okay, yeah, we need an insurance of at least 30 years. But I said, well, okay, but the bank is actually also providing the insurances in this case. So that is a sister company or daughter company providing these insurances. He said, well, that's correct. So I said, well, okay, what if I can convince the contractor, supplier, for example, to give a 30-year warranty on their project or their products in this case? They said, okay, if the manufacturer, and it needs to be a solid manufacturer, dares to provide a 30-year warranty, then we can insure it for 30 years, and then we can provide a mortgage for the same period of 30 years. So for a new project in Delft that was completely new, we suggested to use this technology. We never did it before. We followed that same route. So first to the supplier, a proper supplier, they offered a 30-year warranty. And then the insurance company said, okay, we can insure it for the 30 years. And then the bank came, okay, we can supply a mortgage for the same 30 years. So that is a different kind of strategy in order to get these kind of innovations into the market. But it needs a lot of cooperation of all these parties, of course, because when one party resists, yeah, it's impossible to implement these kind of innovations for floating structures. So that is a nice example in a period without regulations or with few regulations and innovative products for floating houses, so floating structures. If we're looking at regulations itself, Back in those days, there were no regulations. The only regulation was like you need to have a freeboard of 30 centimeters. But if you have a 3-level building, for example, 30 centimeters is like nothing. So we actually developed or researched for safe guidelines. So what kind of freeboard, and that is actually the distance between the water and the top of the hull. So what kind of freeboard you need there? And we actually took some of the inshore marine guidelines in order to determine the maximum tilt, for example, what kind of wind speeds to take in order to calculate the wind forces, etc., etc. So and we implemented that in our projects that we did back then, and that led to safer and more comfortable buildings compared to the lawless market in that time. We just developed or designed the houses based on the capabilities of the company, and actually not looking at the comfort levels. So, for example, in 2000, I believe it was 2006, 2007, we were invited for the project in Amsterdam, Eiber. They asked us to participate in the project to supply some of the floating houses there. I asked for the plots, so actually the space in which the building could be built on the water. So the plot size was in this case, for example, 7 meters wide and 10 meters long, and the people were allowed to build 3 stories high, so 3 levels. It means that you create a building from the bottom of the hull to the top of the roof. 3 levels times 3 meters is like 9 meters high. The width is only 7 meters high. So you have a rectangular on its side in the water. So in basis, that is an unstable situation. So we said, okay, if this is the limitation for these houses there on these plots, we want to decline the offer and don't want to build there because we can expect some problems there. So I did ask them, okay, to the municipality of Amsterdam, okay, what is the reason for that small width of that specific plot? And they said, well, okay, that was the advice of the houseboat builders to build it like 7 meters wide. I said, okay, but the reason that they gave you that advice is that because they are limited with the dry docks to 7 meters. So it is not from a proper incentive to give you that advice of 7 meters. It's just their own motivation, their own limitation in production. So they did the project, and after the first house was being put into place there, I received a phone call with the first problem. The house was tilted, only had a freeboard of 1 centimeter, and he asked me if I could offer a solution in order to increase the freeboard and repair the houses. And there were a lot of complaints about the stability. So a lot of people getting seasick on the top level of the building itself because of the movement due to the wind and the instability of the building itself. So yeah, these principles, these are very important for comfortable living, safe living on water. And that's now more regulated. So you have a maximum tilt of 5 degrees, for example. You have a minimum allowed freeboard of depending on the live load inside the building, but that has been increased. So there's a lot of safety implemented now in these building regulations. So that has been improved. The only thing that hasn't been put in yet, that is the comfort level. So that's left out in the building code, but I believe that should be implemented as well, because people are expecting a floating house to be like a regular land-based house. stable. But yeah, you're still on a boat. So it tends to move with wind and moving loads within the building itself. So I believe the comfort level should be implemented as well, so that there is a maximum of G forces allowed on a certain level in the building. So that is a little bit of the past.
I mean, it's so many fascinating stories. I think it's such an incredible, like, eye-opening exercise for anyone in this space, or any like architect, designer, engineer, to just like think of and the entire ecosystem you're getting into when you try to realize something new, right? And the story around the insurance, right? I think a lot of, like, when like professional goes out of like college, graduate school, you're not sure any of this, right? Like no one tells you. You're like, so you're like honing in the technical stuff, or you're like developing these design skills, and then you come out and then you're like, well, you got to convince insurance people, because, you know, that's how you can do a project. So as an educator, also as another hat of mine, I'm like very keen on bringing these awareness to like next generation, like innovators, right? Because like insurance, we see this in like US, even with like timber structures. It's not common, and it's not as common throughout US because of not only just like regulations, but insurance companies don't want to insure, right? Because there are not a lot of, again, benchmarks. So they're not sure what they're going to insure. And so that like back and forth between the bank and the insurance, and going to the supplier and like getting a warranty from the supplier, like that entire supply chain is actually your collaborators in an innovation tech. So we have the habit of like finger pointing when things don't work out. Oh, like finance didn't allow us, or like legal said that the supply chain is that. But in the end, you need everybody
That's true.
if you really want to make something happen. And I think we don't, like, one common issue I see in not only young professionals, but like professionals today at large in general, you know, just there's this like us versus them type of like mindset a little bit. Like we think it's the best design to go on the site, you know, and
Yep.
but there's like no communication, like, oh, and they need to just understand that, you know, they just need to know that. And I think even the example you shared on, you know, the 7 meter, just because it's their own limitation or experience or historic knowledge, you know, like they advise based on something that is not necessarily accurate, just because it's their own capability and like experience. And so it also is a great example of how to, like, you might need to reframe the brief from the client, or you can't rely on, and we see this in tech also, right? Like, oh, research gave me this, so I'm going to develop that. I'm not going to look into anything about the research or question anything about the research. These are my data points. Fine, I'll just work with these, right? But we almost, I don't think we have that luxury anymore. Maybe we didn't in the past either, but we just got away with it because things were not moving as fast and the world wasn't as volatile, and we didn't have as many problems, or we had, but we didn't know, we weren't exposed to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I feel like now we just need to really find the space to be critical of everything, and just to double check on things. And we see this in like different innovation projects as well, even in like consumer goods products, right? The vendor, like a 20-year-old vendor of a company, tells them it's not manufacturable because they don't want to disrupt their production line, and it's not worth the money, you know, unless they're producing it in millions and they're going to make millions of dollars. It's not worth it. So it's, oh, you know, it's not feasible. And a lot of the times that doesn't get questioned. Or, you know, okay, let's ask another vendor, you know, like that is. So I think we have to keep that mindset where how do we become, how can we be very agile in creating the right ecosystem for innovation to thrive, and also be critical of what we're being exposed to, even if it's the client brief, to your point. Like you had to, and this was like early on too, I'm sure you would love to have the project immediately, but you have to reject it because you knew it was not right.
Yep.
Um, So that like critical, this is like everything you're sharing is like great example of like we need to collaborate with the entire ecosystem that's going to help us innovate.
Exactly.
And we need to be critical of the information that we're provided with and leave space for that critical thinking.
Exactly. And of course, you gave an example of the production process that's too expensive to implement some of the products, or that a certain product hasn't finished its product life cycle yet. So that is, of course, yeah, there's a proper way of doing your business or doing your products, because you have a product life cycle. You have and the innovation has to wait until the end of that life cycle to renew your product line. So the financing, the cost is of course a very important part in building these kind of projects as well, the floating projects. So there's also the future of building at sea, for example. So a lot of parties are working on that as well, or researching the possibilities. And then you really need to take a look at, of course, you have the technical challenges, you have the safety because of large waves and those kind of things, but also the cost aspect comes into play. So is it affordable? Do we really want to, or do we really need to build at sea, for example? And those are the proper questions to ask yourself. So what I tell everyone is the following. For example, for floating or building on water, floating houses aren't a goal on itself. It's just a tool to reach your goal. So if you want to make flood-proof buildings, for example, it doesn't necessarily have to be floating. It can be put on stilts, or you can make it flood-proof by limiting the damage to the house itself. So after a flood, that can be cleaned easily or whatever. So that is also a form of climate-proof building. You can also solve flooding, for example, in different ways. So avoid any damages by managing the water. So providing space for water in case of flooding. So those are all different kind of tools, methods, in order to reach that goal, and that is to reduce the cost of or reduce the effects of flooding in this case. So yeah, you always need to take a look at the cost, because it needs to be beneficial for all parties. So for example, reusing old city harbors, that's actually a good idea, because the municipality often doesn't know what to do with these old city harbors. They are unused. You have the people who likes to live near the city center. Yeah, and the building cost might be a little bit higher, but because of the higher value of these kind of buildings in the neighborhood of the city center, it will be affordable again. So then you have a win-win-win situation in which a project is more feasible, not only on the technical side of things, but also on the financial side of things. So that is something to keep in mind in these situations or these kind of projects for it to succeed. So if you're telling people, for example, you want to build a floating city or a floating neighborhood in the middle of the countryside, well, there is plenty of land surrounding that small piece of water. Is it useful to build on water? While you know it's about 20% more expensive than a comparable land-based house. You really need to question yourself then. Is the right tool in that situation? And that is, yeah, people sometimes forget it because their goal is building on water. Actually,
Yeah.
consider it as
Yeah,
a tool.
like yeah, exactly. That's kind of like missing the point and why they matter. And this also is like touches upon what we were saying, like just be critical of what you're presented with. Sometimes you don't need to design it for the sake of designing it, right? Is it actually the optimal solution for that? So, I mean, we had like a great view into the history of like what happened with like floating structures, and some of the real examples you shared were so valuable. Where do you see it going, or where do you want it to go? Like, where do you want to see the status of like floating structures like 20, 30 years from now?
20, 30 years from now, I think it will be more accepted because we have the regulations in the Netherlands, for example, and it will evolve or will go international as well with these kind of regulations, because a lot of countries are adapting regulations from each other. Again, Dubai, we wanted to adopt the regulations from the Netherlands and already adopted, for example, the railway regulations from Italy, and so they're getting their regulations from everywhere. So I think it will go abroad eventually, more and more. Of course, already projects are starting up abroad, so we are not unique in the Netherlands in that regard. I think it will increase the market. It will always be a niche market, so it's not as big as the regular building industry. It will always be a niche, I believe. But I think it will be a little bit easier for project developers, for contractors, for municipalities to build floating houses, floating projects, and that they can get a little bit bigger in size, in volume of houses within a single project. But yeah, it's still, I think it still remains limited because it really needs to add value to a certain area. Like explained before, the goal is not to build on water. The goal is to have a flood-proof environment, and you can solve that in different ways. So, for example, some people say, okay, let's build a floating village, floating city, just flood the area and build floating houses. And then I asked them a simple question: what about the other infrastructure in the neighborhood? We're gonna just ignore it, destroy it? What do we gonna do with that infrastructure? Okay, no, we're just gonna build in flood-proof houses then, with floating houses. I said, but then again, then we stop protecting the other houses in the neighborhood, infrastructure, etc., etc. We stop with that. And then they say, okay, yeah, maybe it isn't really a good idea to build floating. I said, yeah, you really need to think about the other aspects as well, or other sites as well. It's not like isolated, that floating structure. You still have to take care of the complete environment. So maybe a combination would be better. So put in place a better water management, create places in which where water can flow to, especially alongside rivers, for example. So in case of flooding of a river, that you allow certain designated areas to flood, in which it can't do any harm or less harm. In combination with some flood-proof buildings. So buildings that is just like a regular building, but you take into account that it can flood that house, that can be repaired quite easily or just being cleaned. And then in other areas where it is possible to have some floating houses or floating structures. So that, yeah, it's a different perspective in a building floating structures, for example.
Yeah, I think we just need to accept, like with the volatility with like nature maybe like rising in the future, and in our case also, well, the project we collaborated on was in the name of earthquake resilience when the land is not suitable for it. I think we just have to have almost like a toolkit of innovations, right? Like, okay, what is the best tool or response in this like situation, and assess really based on context, budget, the people there, acceptance, regulations, like everything. And with that consideration, like have kind of like a
going back to your like domain, right? Like durable, sustainable structures, like what in our toolkit is most suitable here, right? And then that's the response. So I think, we often say this for like tech rather than like developing tech for the sake of developing tech or like treating tech like human, which is happening in AI now, but like reminding ourselves that it's actually a great tool to help us get where we really want to get. So what's actually the real issue or the real problem or the context? So I think that really helps us kind of have like a global understanding of what's going on and then respond accordingly. So thank you for sharing all that. I think like I had no idea about like the timeline of like everything happening, like floating structures and the challenges. And it's always very interesting to see how some of the issues that you're talking about are quite chronic in different industries even. And I think there's a lot of analogous like learning opportunity here too. I do want to be mindful of our time, so I'm going to come to our last segment, which is for anyone who wants to, push boundaries a little bit, make some progress, innovate in a field. What would be your advice to them?
Keep an open mind and don't just focus on one part because it's all connected to each other. So like I explained before, you have to deal with insurances, you have to deal with local stakeholders, you have to deal with the technology. It's an integral part, and that is the most important thing. Not to focus just on one element, because then you are forgetting all the other aspects that is very important and can influence your specific project or your specific idea. And then it tends to fail if you don't keep into account all the other stakeholders, for example. So to give just one example, we talked with a large contracting company in Japan, Tokyo, and they wanted to build floating houses. So they were looking at the Tokyo Bay, for example. I said to them, well, okay, if you want to build floating houses there, you have to take into account the big waves that can come there. So for the comfort level in your house, and if you have like a house size of 10 by 10 meters, for example, and you have the very long waves rolling underneath your house, yeah, for sure you get sick. So I said, okay, make it more easy. If you want to have some prototypes or a first start for building floating houses there in Tokyo, just start with the canals, for example. But don't forget the stakeholders there, because the people there, yeah, they don't like a new house in front of their house, so that it's blocking their view. So everything is interconnected. And then they actually gave one of these examples that they tried to build a floating house within a canal, and that's exactly the same problem occurred there with the stakeholders, people who didn't want to have a floating house in front of their house. So yeah, keep an open mind and don't forget the environment. So all the other stakeholders that have an influence on your idea, your project, your vision, everything. So it needs to be a broad view.
The systems view. Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much, Jelle. This was such a pleasure. And I feel like I want to talk to you about floating structures like all day, which, like some might argue, like, it's not the maybe most interesting subject, but then you're like, yeah, but talk to Jelle. You will want to talk about it all day. Thank you so much for this and for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.